Hey everybody, this is another webinar here from Searchmetrics, and I'm really pleased and proud to have Bartosz here with us in the webinar. So he's one of the most known guys, I mean, not just in Europe, around the world when it comes to super hardcore SEO, especially when it comes to JavaScript. And as we all know, JavaScript is not just liked and used by a lot of developers, it's also now crawlable and indexable by Google. Even if your title of this webinar, Bartosz, is a little bit intriguing with indexing your content in optional, but Bartosz is also pretty well known for doing a lot of tests and research over the past couple of years and kind of like challenging Google with quotes they have, like Gary Illich, you know, and he's challenging them by doing a lot of tests and research. What is Google really actually crawlable and what isn't? And I'm very happy to be here with Bartosz in this webinar. And he already told me he has a lot of new research that he's done in the last couple of weeks. And it's the first time you said, right? It's the first time that you're going to research. This is phenomenal. So I'm a little bit like a child now. I mean, like listening into the slides, and I really hope that you all are going to enjoy the webinar. As like with all webinars, we're going to collect and answer the questions you have during and at the end of the webinar. So I will try to take notes and look at the questions. Christina is here next to me, is going to help me with the filtering, all that stuff. And please do not kind of like stop, you know, putting questions in as we try to kind of filter and answer them during the
more the questions, the better. Yeah.
Exactly.
Sorry.
Yes, and
sorry. Thank you thank you so much for the intro, Marcus. Just so everyone knows, I'm not gonna be talking about JavaScript that much today. I'll try to keep it a little bit simpler and focus on some of the indexing issues for non-JavaScript websites like H&M, Sephora, and so on. So it's gonna be kind of easier to digest for non-geeks.
Perfect. I mean, that's good. I mean, it's also like important to have a very good foundation when it comes to SEO. And let's just start with the webinar now. I'm super curious. And over to you, Bartosz. And I will try to be your wingman and interrupt you whenever is needed. And let's have a conversation.
Ask as many questions as possible. Okay, so let's move forward. So basically today we're going to be talking about some of the issues we're seeing with indexing the content. And just to give you a little bit of a clickbait for the very, very beginning, some of the data we're going to be talking about is just 63% of Walmart's pages, products are not indexed in Google. So this is one of the key problems. Then H&M is using exactly this many, almost 5 million visits per month because of their indexing issues as well. And then Topshop, 24% of the products are not indexed in Google. And this is actually kind of, I don't want to say funny, but interesting, because Topshop is leaving the offline completely. So they're closing down offline stores to move online with just 76 of their content of their products indexed. So this is a massive problem for them as well. Yoox, this is the most shocking one. I will mention that later on. Yoox, Snapdeal, those websites are the worst out of these 5. But I just want to have your attention for some of the data bits, and let's move forward. So, just to have like a little bit of like an emotional intro, this is quite interesting for me, because my first JavaScript article ever was published, and actually wrote it in Searchmetrics office during one of my trainings in Berlin. So I find it kind of like that we have a full circle now with some of the new research that's again released during Searchmetrics webinar. But in 2016, JavaScript was, I'm wondering, Marcus, if you, there is a little bit of delay with slides, isn't it?
Yes, I think, delay. Yes.
Yeah. So
I'm just saying, when you talk, just make sure that you have, let's say 2-3 seconds before you start talking about the new slide that we are not seeing yet.
Okay, that's going to be very challenging for me with my slides, but I'll try to behave. So in 2016, JavaScript was kind of exotic, and people didn't really believe that this is going to be a massive problem. But there was one extremely exciting. I'm pushing for the slide to show you. So one extremely exciting event where actually Netflix won with Hulu because of the JavaScript, because of how they understood JavaScript. So Hulu lost all of the traffic, like most of the traffic after their kind of JavaScript website got published. And Netflix, and this is quite interesting for all the geeks out there. Netflix is one of the thought leaders in the field of web performance and JavaScript and new frameworks and so on. So Netflix was extremely like thinking forward with how they look at JavaScript, and they won online just because of JavaScript. They won with Hulu. So this is something this is one of my favorite examples, when you can use technology to win with a different brand, both kind of online and offline. But let's fast forward. Like, this is enough like reminiscent like of memories. Let's fast forward to today. And as of today, and I'm not going to be talking a lot about JavaScript, because we're kind of past the moment when JavaScript was just exotic again. Now there is no such thing as an HTML website, and this is something I wanted to show you today. One of the things that we actually have, what I'm going to be talking about today, is that 80% of the websites use JavaScript for the crucial content. So basically, 80% of the largest e-commerce stores we checked from, I think, top 500 or so of the biggest e-commerce stores. This was in the US. Use JavaScript to show their content, show their products, show their some kind of the content that you can see. So if you switch off JavaScript, their content kind of disappears. This also means that Google needs to have quite a lot of extra resources to just index their content, to find their products. And this is where we actually get to the meat, because rendering is optional. But then if we look at all the brands that use and rely on JavaScript to show their content, so it's Amazon, Best Buy, Apple, like all of the biggest e-commerce stores. And again, Walmart, 63, or I don't remember exactly, but I think, let me look it up, 63 of their content is not indexed in Google because of JavaScript. So if you look at that, Walmart is a massive store. I'm not sure how many products they have, but I'm guessing it's hundreds of thousands of products not indexed.
Can I ask a question? So
sure.
I mean, also because you said JavaScript was exotic, and that's true. I mean, it's not anymore, but in the past, pre-rendering services were used heavily to pre-render JavaScript and then give the pre-rendered page to Google. How is that now the case? Is that needed anymore, or have you discovered something like this?
That's an amazing question. I actually never thought of that. We are so focused on the research that we didn't thought about. For us, pre-rendering is so kind of last season. So with these websites, they are not JavaScript websites. So this is kind of interesting. We're going to get to that. They use JavaScript for just tiny bits of the page where they, we're going to get through that. But basically, they use different modules, different components, and just one JavaScript component can break the whole kind of indexing circle. So pre-rendering won't be a solution. But we'll get to that. This is an amazing question, and yeah, we kind of should. Yeah, sorry, we were very focused on that. Pre-rendering is kind of something that slipped our mind. So let's look at some of the data. You're gonna like that, Marcus. So Urban Outfitters, 0% of the JavaScript content indexed. JCrew, 0. Topshop. This is again, none of their JavaScript content is indexed. The same with Sephora, it goes to 42%, which is obviously kind of better than H&M, and obviously German engineering. So T-Mobile is is doing best out of the brands here. and let's close it with Nike with just 22% of the JavaScript content index. So we're seeing that this is obviously not all of their content, but even those parts of the website missing from the crawl, from the index, are quite shocking. So let's look at H&M, because this is one of my favorite case studies, where you look at H&M. I hope the video is going to be working. I'm going to work with the 2-second delay. So you should see, oh yeah, I see the preview. So basically you can see that this is how I previewed the H&M's website with JavaScript switched on. And then I switch off JavaScript, which is difficult to explain with a delay. But yeah, switch off JavaScript, and yeah, scroll down. And then you can see that obviously the images don't load, but I try to click on the load more button, and it doesn't work. Not to mention that Google doesn't click, which is a whole other problem. So Google doesn't click, which is one, but also without JavaScript, so without rendering the whole page, which is a massive cost, you can't see more than 72 out of 234 articles. These are Christmas gifts. So we can assume that a lot of those Christmas gifts won't be indexed or won't be accessible through this path. They may be accessible from like sitemap or something else, but this is where it gets difficult.
Bartosz, is it possible to have a rel next and rel pref there? I mean, because Google, even if you don't see it on the website, Google is reading the rel next and rel pref tags. Have you checked this?
The simplest way ever is for a search engine, just have a physical button, have a HTML. So basically, it's not cloaking, just have HTML and serve it to search engines and so on, or anyone who has for God knows why JavaScript switched off. You should have some kind of fallback of just have HTML like a button you can click. But then it gets even more shocking with H&M. I run 2 crawls, one with Java. This is right from other Marcus, but so we run 2 crawls with JavaScript and without JavaScript. So if you look at that, without JavaScript, we have this was a 50,000 crawl. We have most of the pages canonicalized. So also we can see that JavaScript is changing canonicals, because then boom, with JavaScript, all those canonicals disappear. So this, you can see this is kind of interesting on so many levels, because now if Google is going to render, then everything changes. If they are not going to render, it's just, it becomes very, very complex. I won't go into trying to understand that in depth, because we're waiting for H&M to hire us to do that. But basically this is a massive problem. So you can read more about. We published a case study. We published an article like diving into that problem. You can read it here. But now, and this is the moment when we partially addressed Marcus's question about pre-rendering, because right now, it's mostly part of the content that rely on JavaScript. So for example, this is H&M pagination. Then some of the other stores you might also be interested in. So this is some kind of internal linking they use, top products. And again, those parts, they are invisible with JavaScript switched off, or if Google is not going to render. Reviews, obviously, comments, medium.com, a lot of their comments are not indexable, and main content, which is not common, but for example, ASOS.com, all of their main content is served with JavaScript. But now I want to talk about like a more difficult part, and just I was talking to Martin Split yesterday on Twitter, just saying that I'm going to be as gentle as possible. So this is a statement that Martin and John are amazing, but there are some kind of things that kind of make our lives as SEOs difficult. So one of the statements from this year's conference was that 90% of the websites get, and most of the SEOs understood, indexed within 5 seconds. So this was about JavaScript websites, and this is the source of that slide. So Martin mentioned at the Chrome Dev Summit that 5 seconds is a median for rendering. And Martin said himself that this slide was not his best work. And this may be a little bit confusing because this is not 5 seconds to index. This is 5 seconds. And yeah, we're all kind of excited, like, okay, my content is going to be indexed within 5 seconds. It's a little bit more complex. And even Ilya Grigorik, so Martin's boss, tweeted that in a way that he missed. Even Ilya Grigorik misunderstood that tweet, saying that this is 5 seconds to render, which is not the case. So we need to kind of address some of those geeky parts. And then there was a whole conversation about that, saying that rendering is different than the queue, and then this is the 5 seconds is the percentage of the time for the queue. So basically, to end this kind of painful part, it's all about queue latency. So if you compare that to shopping, if you go into like Tesco or whatever store, this is the time when you actually have your shopping collected and you're waiting in line, but then there are a lot of other things happening later on. So this metric, unfortunately, from SEO point of view, is completely useless. We can't see that because we're not responsible for indexing. We can see when the website was crawled and when it was indexed. What happens in between is difficult. So this is actually between. Sorry, do you want to ask? Yeah.
Yes, I do have one question according to the time and the indexing, because often JavaScript is triggered by certain events. So for example, you have something like on scroll or on focus events. So for example, you show the H&M site and the products are loading only when you start scrolling. So doesn't these actions do affect the JavaScript rendering time a lot?
Oh, this is so basically just for H&M to get rendered, Google needs to go through the whole heuristics of, is there a difference between one version of the website and the other, and is this difference significant? So in case of H&M, I would assume that this test would basically return that those two versions, they look more or less identical because the content shows up. The only problem is that you cannot interact with them with the content, which is not something that Google is going to check. So, and also Google doesn't scroll. So Google doesn't scroll, Google doesn't click. So this is one more thing that's kind of problematic.
Yes,
but yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and this is actually something where JavaScript is important to catch user interaction and then load the certain elements dynamically.
Yeah.
Can I also ask another question? It's rather technical, but maybe it just fits the current thing we are in, which is a question from the audience. Have you seen a boost in SEO performance while migrating from Angular.js to React, like React server-side rendering? Have you seen any? So we have talked about this in the past. Is that still the case that you should avoid Angular more than React.js?
So I think we're a little bit past that moment. Google is very good and manages very good to address all the different frameworks. And Angular had a lot of issues by design that were not only Google issues, but they were basically, Angular is built by Google. There were not only search engine issues, but there were basically problems with the repositories they were creating. So that was our original research found problems that weren't Google problems, like search engine problems, but basically the code was broken. Right now, Google's resources to render are massive. The problem is that first of all, triggering that rendering is kind of tricky, and then all the heuristics around that are not amazing. So basically, moving from Angular to React is not going to change anything. But if you're server-side rendering, you're basically moving from Angular to HTML. So So that's obviously we saw massive boost, because with indexing, the change in traffic and visibility is instant, because you don't have indexable content, and now you do have indexable content. You can have a look at Hulu's drop when they moved to the JavaScript framework that wasn't indexable back in the day. They lost all of the traffic by like 85%. So this question is kind of layered. If you're moving from Angular to React, I wouldn't really worry about, I wouldn't see any massive potential here. But if you're moving from Angular to server-side rendered React, so HTML, then yeah. But sorry, I don't want to lose our non-technical audience.
That's interesting, because several people have questions about this. And maybe to wrap it up, so if you move to server-side rendering, which means you have content in HTML rendered, then there shouldn't be any problems with Google indexing, right?
Yeah, because then you're basically only that you're on some kind of framework. Google sees HTML, and yeah, that's how we should do that. So basically, addressing that part, like wrapping up with Martin's statement, the 5 seconds, because this is something that was repeated quite often, is something we're not seeing. So this wasn't a perfect communication from Google's point of view. So just to wrap this out, there is no time frame for JavaScript indexing. So it's not 5 seconds. When you have a JavaScript website, or when you're like some of your components rely on JavaScript, which is, we can be sure that whoever is watching us, if you have a large website, you have some kind of JavaScript dependencies. Then there is no set time frame for that. For example, medium.com, we're seeing comments from 2 years ago not indexed because of JavaScript. So that's something to have in mind. And basically, we have good news and bad news. So 60 in our, because we've built a tool set around that, 60% of the JavaScript content is being indexed within 24 hours, looking at some of the stats, which is good. So 60% of the JavaScript content is indexed within the first 24 hours on average. But so that's after indexing HTML. But the bad news is that after 1 month, there's still 32% of websites have not indexed JavaScript. So 32% is not indexed within a month. So so basically, you either get indexed within the first 24 hours, or you won't get indexed almost at all. So this is something to have in mind. And this is why thousands of domains are not fully indexed as of today, even months up from publishing the content. So it's not really about time and waiting and 2 waves anymore. It's kind of difficult. But now
have you seen a pattern, Bartosz, why this could be the case for so many websites?
Yeah, well, let's basically the next slide is the roots of the problem. So so this is going to explain the whole thing step by step. So basically, after web development changed over the last years, we all every single website, I'm guessing Searchmetrics.com as well, developers are not going with like body, like HTML body, and they don't write it from scratch. They use ready-to-go components. Including WordPress websites, because again, WordPress websites, we saw WordPress websites that are not indexed because of some of the parts of the themes are often JavaScript. So it's not that WordPress is immune to that problem, which is even more interesting. Medium, we actually published an article on Medium, medium.com. I think 16% or so of the content, or even more, is not indexed. So medium.com is struggling with indexing. So the content platform, which is, for me, it's shocking. But yeah, so usually the components are like menus, sliders, the main content, which is not very often, facet navigation, comments, related products. So those are different components, and your developers are not really building them from scratch. So that's basically how the web development is working. So even if one of those when Google decides not to render your page because they don't see massive changes in content, which we're going to get to, you may see this, which basically leads to two completely different website graphs, and it's extremely confusing for search engines because they don't see a lot of the parts of the navigation, of the links, and so on. So this is H&M, for example. If we simplify that, we say, okay, some of the categories, subcategories are visible, but then with JavaScript, everything works. So this is more or less the structure. I know it's a beautiful drawing, but then if you switch off JavaScript, you won't find quite a lot of the products because, for example, the pagination is broken or something else. So that's again why those problems are happening with the crawl. So the biggest thing we need to address that rendering is not Google's indexer default mode, and this is something to address with different frameworks. Rendering is triggered by different heuristics, and this gets really confusing. And it's not even about that being complex; it's just basically about that being unclear. This is the problem. So when I talked to Googlers in Zurich this year, I asked a lot of questions, and one of those, how do they see that they need to render a page? I would assume that they see a difference, and they confirm that. Basically, they look at the rendered content and not rendered content. So every single domain we can assume is at least rendered once, and if there is a difference, they render that by default. So basically, if they see again, there is no, and this is the part that you need to. Where's my? So the render doesn't diff as much. So basically, they look. Okay, is there a difference? How significant is the difference between the rendered version and not rendered version, which is getting even more complex. Basically, they compare two versions, and those heuristics are not fully understood by Googlers and basically people because they're not human readable. Because I'm just assuming based on some kind of machine learning, some kind of algorithms that are not something that, or Martin can just open a book and see, okay, this is how this works. It gets really complex. Because they need to save resources because rendering is extremely expensive. So those heuristics, I need to remember that, are very far from being perfect. So I wouldn't really, at this moment, I wouldn't really rely on those to deliver to deliver like a steady flow of organic traffic. But one more thing that's actually even more exciting is that all new sites get rendered. So if you're running an experiment on a new domain, all of our experiment got indexed within minutes. Like every single page, and we were like, wow, Google is really good with indexing. But then we started looking to the clients, and they were like, but this is not what we see with some of the big e-commerce brands. So this is something like, this news is something I'm struggling with because of that, we can't really experiment, we can't play with that anywhere else, but within like real large domains. So if you look at what is a new website, if you publish an article on, for example, medium.com, and there are no comments, Google is going to check, okay, the rendering didn't change anything, but the comments didn't come up yet. So the comments, for example, that are built with JavaScript are not going to be picked up later on. That's just my random example. So the logic behind those heuristics is unknown, something we can't really also figure out with experiments. This is where we need to say that clearly there is no way to experiment to figure this out, to kind of reverse engineer something this complex. And there are a lot of limitations that we need to address here as well. Limitations with that, for example, if you have a staging website, then it's not, it may work very well with Google because it's a new subdomain or whatever, then you push it to production, it fails. So it changes how we should approach web development completely. So this is basically something we change in our workflow with clients 180 degrees. But then there's one more interesting part: rendering versus crawler budget. This is where it gets also quite interesting. And there is this myth in the SEO community that CPU cost or the CPU load of your website affects rendering. Because of this slide. That was very, very, very unfortunate, and it was this year at the Webmaster Conference. So this was the slide by Eric. I don't remember this tournament. One of the Google engineers, Eric, with a K, who said that they limit CPU consumption, they interrupt scripts, and few months before that, Martin told me that CPU doesn't matter from their standpoint. So he said that this slide is basically misunderstood. It was only in extreme cases when someone is mining Bitcoin with JavaScript or something like that. And this led to a whole conversation when people tweeted that in a good faith. They tweeted some of the findings from that conference, and then we tried to straighten it up with Martin. So either me or Martin, because CPU doesn't affect rendering and doesn't affect indexing in theory within what we would call a reasonable load. But the origins of that is just to have something a little bit lighter for the audience. Back in 2017 and 18, Adi Osmani showed how much CPU affects web performance. So for example, if you're on a cheaper phone, you will have BBC, CNN load much slower than on an iPhone. And we assumed as well that this is how Google is going to look at that, because the cost of rendering is high. It's basically very complicated. So I wouldn't look at the CPU when diagnosing indexing issues. And we actually built a tool set that sorry, yeah?
If Google is looking at CPU, is Google looking at the time, how long it takes to render the page? Because if you have a lot of scripts that have dependencies, as you know, the rendering and loading the whole page with JavaScript often takes many seconds or even more than a minute. Have you experienced any gap in terms of after 20 seconds Google stops waiting?
So we played with that, and we saw Google. So we basically used I forgot the name. There is a way of like calculating endless numbers with JavaScript, Fibonacci's, and Google was extremely patient. So we couldn't find one moment. There were even some moments when they basically went so deep that the CPU cost, like our desktops would crash at that point, and Google still indexed that. So. So I guess it's a little bit more complicated. We were really trying to outsmart Google, saying, okay, they'll only index like to this number, or like Fibonacci number. We'll know exactly what the CPU load was, and we had very kind of random results with that. Also, it was a new domain, so again, we had that switched on full throttle by default. So we would have to play with that on a real domain, but we also don't want to kill our clients' crawler budget. So yeah, this is complicated. But if you wanna play, if you wanna see how costly your website is, you can check it for free. We basically build a toolset to see the cost. It looks like that. You know that, Marcus, already, but basically the cost of Searchmetrics is a little bit higher than we would recommend. Cost of rendering Searchmetrics.com. But I also guess that you don't have this many visits from mobile phones. I guess it's still just like our website. You have quite a lot of heavy users on desktops.
Yes, we are using a lot of ready-to-use components on the website. Mm-hmm. Often these components are not optimized. So that's a good example of how and why users should check these components and maybe exchange them. And things, but we are still in the yellow area.
We're still like just I will tell that to you, but don't tell anyone. I was running this test like 10 times until we went and below. So I had like 10 tests to show the lower score to kind of show that we're good. And our website is way less complex than Searchmetrics. If you just give me a second, I will close the shade because the sun is hitting my face directly and it's kind of difficult. 1 second.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't expect sun in Poland. I didn't see that see sun here in weeks, but yeah, better now than never. So basically, you can check the cost of both CPU and memory. So the score here is basically more or less how you can see if your website is going to load quickly on a slower mobile device. That's the only thing we can use it for right now. In theory, it shouldn't affect indexing and rendering within the reasonable time frame. So let's talk about content indexing time frame, because this is very interesting, and we're gonna leave the JavaScript topic for a second, which so everyone who's not very technical can finally breathe. So this is sorry, it's still JavaScript. We'll get to HTML in a second. So if we look at big brands, so for example, CNBC, The Guardian, Target actually has a lot of indexing issues as well. After 2 weeks, they still struggle with quite a lot of content. But if we look at New York Post, it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be this bad. Basically, if you use ready to go components that are somehow JavaScript, and you cannot pre-render that, which was the beginning of our conversation, because pre-rendering the whole website just because you have one component would be a massive overkill. But if you look at New York Post, they use JavaScript, but that JavaScript is fully indexed within those 2 weeks. So you can do that. But also, if you want to see trends, this is something we did this is a very geeky tool. Basically, this tool checks how much JavaScript content is not indexed after 1 day. So this is a little bit like Mostcast or all the other, like Alguru, all those other casts, but this is only showing if Google is getting better with indexing JavaScript on scale. So if Google is going to say, we're indexing JavaScript perfectly fine, you don't need to worry, you will know after visiting this page if this is right or not. This is why we knew that 5 seconds to index is kind of unreal if we're talking averages. But you can also compare that with HTML. And now we're seeing that also indexing HTML is not it's not a given. It's not something we can assume that, okay, I have an HTML content, it's going to be fully indexed. So this is like, for me, it was shocking to see HTML indexing after 24 hours in the 80s%. I would expect that to be at least 90-something%. And this is the data sample from quite a lot of very big brands from the US. It's mostly US and some of the websites from Germany and a few websites from UK. I think it's in a few hundreds websites where we basically manually add pieces of content to see if the new pages are indexed. We scrape the new sitemap, we look at the date. So it's very, very complex, and the data here definitely adds up. You can compare HTML versus JavaScript. You can see, okay, because basically to index JavaScript, you need to have HTML indexed first. We basically call HTML like URL indexed first. So those fluctuate quite a bit. So now let's go into diagnosing rendering issues, and this is quite interesting as well. So if you like BBC, one of my favorite examples, basically. With JavaScript enabled and disabled, you have completely different content. And I'm guessing they use some kind of geo-targeting that relies on JavaScript. But I'm using BBC here just as an example of how the content is going to change by JavaScript. So for example, here you can see within our toolset, I forgot to add the link here, that the canonical tag is going to be changed by JavaScript. So that's something we saw in case of H&M. So it's going to be changed to a different domain, the tag description, the title, and so on. So you can see, okay, but the robots were the same, so there was no index added by JavaScript. So this is quite useful. This is a free thing. You can play with that, and you can also see the problem we also saw in case of H&M, where the links are added by JavaScript. So just rendering the page adds new links that weren't there before. This is quite interesting as well, or some kind of links that were removed by JavaScript. So that's quite
things, right. Google was following. Okay.
So if Google won't render, they won't find those links. They won't actually see them. So this is interesting. But now is the part I promised, HTML. So these are problems with indexing without any JavaScript dependencies. So this is just raw HTML. So if you look at Eventbrite, after 2 weeks, only 58% of their content is indexed. So this is massive, and we're not talking JavaScript here. They basically have few JavaScript elements within their website, but here we're looking only if the URL, just URL, is indexed. So this is rough. If we look at Target, they're actually very slow to rise if you look at that. So Target, after 1 day, only 3.5% of the content is indexed, and 33% after 2 days, and after 1 week, 78%. So these are the problems that will basically be like, I don't know how e-commerce can maintain online presence without having their products indexed in Google. That's
Okay, but I think that brings us to a pretty good point. So I have questions, and we had questions in the audience about indexing content. So
okay.
First question is, does it make sense to have all products indexed? And because we are talking about e-commerce at the moment, so Eventbrite is not e-commerce, but Target is. And when you make these tests, it might be the case that some of the content should not be indexed because it is thin or duplicate, or would just cannibalize the existing content. So because is your goal here to always have 100% just to have it, or how opinion on does it really make sense to have all content indexed?
So this is an interesting question. So basically how we do that is we scrape the new sitemap. So if there's a new sitemap, we have a way to be kind of alerted about that, and we scrape that new sitemap. So we only look into the new content. So basically, we're looking at that, I think, more or less from a Google standpoint. Obviously, we don't have the crawlers and the queue and so on. We only look at the sitemaps, and we compare the sitemap, look at the new URLs. So my assumption is, sorry?
But often in sitemaps, because sitemaps are generated automatically, there are also URLs included that actually have a no index tag on the page itself.
We look for no index, we look for robots, we look for when the content was actually published. So if someone is going to put a sitemap with old content, we ignore that. So we actually spent 3 weeks just trying to fine tune that, because we're catching quite a lot of junk. And also we do that manually. So basically setting up a sitemap, we play with the sitemap of a given website for 1 or 2 weeks. And we, after seeing that this is a sitemap of new content, we then add it to the database. So there are actually 4 people involved in that process. This was a lot of fun. But we ignore no index, robots, and so on. So, and also, just before publishing that, we have Tomek, our research and development lead, and he's manually checking every single result, like randomly with a sample, because he's got a bad case of OCD like myself, to be sure that this data adds up. But also, if you, sorry.
Yes, no, it totally makes sense. I then see, issues with Target or Eventbrite in a better light. So that's then really a problem for them. But I can also reverse the question, because we had all people asking in the audience about what can they do as a best practice to avoid indexation. So one was asking about using data URL links to actually make the typical old PageRank sculpting as we used to do it when Google was not able to crawl JavaScript. Do you have any recommendation for this, Bartosz, that if we have URLs and they are at the moment in JavaScript and Google is indexing them, is there any other best practice to avoid indexation, like the data URL links?
Oh my God, this is a very old. You basically mean hiding URLs with JavaScript, as it was back in the day in e-commerce.
Yes.
I was never a huge fan of that solution, because then you kind of lose control, because once Google picks it up, it creates a lot of possible problems. I would basically, I'm going to give a very kind of unpopular reply to that question. I would focus on having information architecture and an indexing strategy that doesn't rely on hiding links within your domain. And we never actually did it. We work with a lot of massive e-commerces, and we never had to kind of hide links from Google so Google wouldn't follow them.
But
I'm
isn't
not
it
sure
in e-commerce often the case that many product pages are actually the same? Because if you have, let's say, an iPhone with gray color, you have an iPhone with white color. I mean, the specs are the same, but just the color is different. Does it really make sense to have all these pages indexed? I mean, isn't that like also waste for Google for the crawler?
This is a longer conversation, I think, because it depends on the case. But here, if we're looking at the iPhone scenario with different colors, or if you have one product, or like, especially in some technical e-commerces, when you have one product in like 20,000 varieties, depends on like the millimeters of size or whatever, then it's not something we're addressing here with indexing. This is not how it. Basically, this is not what we checked here with this experiment. How I would approach that is a completely different presentation, different conversation.
Okay. We can move this to the end, but this is obviously more people have questions about indexation and, for example, how to use a faceted navigation to avoid getting crawled massively. For example, when you have filters in your navigation that open a new page with parameters, and it really seems that people have a lot of questions about this. But let's continue now. But let's save some 5 minutes.
Let's come back to that.
Okay, perfect, awesome.
We have a perfect slide now for to wrap up. So basically, just to explain the problem we're addressing here, when the part of your website depends on rendering in general, because it's not only about JavaScript. So in this case, for example, H&M, the load more, the infamous load more button, then it disappears. Google crawls your website, but they're not gathering all of the links they should gather, and it creates a problem with Google only crawling part of the domain without finding all of the valuable content. So then Google indexer is kind of confused, because they cannot find all of the content. It's getting, or they're getting mixed signals, like different canonicals after rendering, or and so on. So the crawler budget fails because of that mess, that kind of disorganized part of the code, and then at the very end, budget is too low to render JavaScript, because JavaScript to render JavaScript, you need to have a fairly decent crawler budget, because it relies on that as well. So this is more or less explanation of what's happening. So if you have just one part of the website breaking the crawl cycle, it's going to lower your crawler budget, your content is not going to be indexed. And again, this leads to this problem here, where there's like HTML websites without their key content indexed. So one of the to-do is go and check your website here, but also crawl your website. Searchmetrics is having like also an amazing feature to crawl JavaScript.
And we have a
Crawl.
new crawler, so I can only make a little bit of
Sure,
commercial.
yeah.
We have a new crawler in our platform that's called, in the part is called Site Experience. Just saying, let's go ahead now, Bartosz.
But yeah, you are one of the first crawlers, like JavaScript crawlers ever, and definitely an amazing thing to play with. So crawl your website with and without JavaScript and compare to crawls, for example, with Searchmetrics. And at some point, what Google is claiming that crawling and indexing, so basically rendering, crawling and indexing, this is the part here, will come closer together, and so eventually this will not be a problem. But looking at our data, that's why we actually build it, to figure out if we need to worry about that. Looking at our data, it's not going to be any time within the next months, because they are still struggling quite a bit. And one thing that we need to add here, that all of the indexing issues are 100% self-induced. So I wouldn't blame Google here. I wouldn't say that Google is failing at something. They are the only search engine that's actually crawling and indexing JavaScript on scale in a fairly decent manner, let's say that. But basically, if you look into the React documentation on Angular, they clearly say from 2015 or 16 that if you have anything that's client-facing, you shouldn't have client-side rendered JavaScript. So this is some kind of shortcut because let's not lie to each other, we could use more. We could all use more developers. I think Searchmetrics. How many developers do you have? You have like a whole floor of them.
Yeah, we have 65 developers plus product management, IT, etc. So about 80 people on the product.
So I'm guessing you could easily squeeze in there twice this many and still be busy with work. So there's never enough developers. That's what I'm trying to say, because then there's always quite a lot of work to do. Even though Searchmetrics, I think you have one of the biggest development team I know about.
And there's one interesting thing with developers, let's not call it problem thing, and this is, I think, what many of the SEOs face in companies, is that developers, they really do like all the new frameworks. I mean, also frameworks that are not even in a stable version available, they do like all the new stuff, which, as we know, created a lot of problems with Google in the end. So this is where the SEO needs to become the moderator between, what actually should be achieved and what actually Google is able to crawl at the moment.
Oh, thank you for that, Marcus. That's a very good point. I love it. One of the frameworks, that's just to make it kind of interesting at the end of this webinar, Basecamp has their own JavaScript framework. Like, there are so many new frameworks that I never knew about. But yeah, so basically use whichever framework you like, as long as you have a developer who understands that in depth, so they don't only do something that works, but it also works with search engines, social media platforms, and so on. But in general, we need to redefine on how we're looking at the crawler budget, because there are different factors affecting it now than back in the day. So it's not only about like index bloat or having too many thin content pages, which is still, just don't get me wrong, which is still massively important. Like, information architecture is still our number one step we take with every single client, and indexing strategy and so on. But even if those are in a tip-top shape, which is always a journey, which is never like we're done completely. But even if those are, let's say, perfect, there are a few other things now that are part of that game. And my biggest point today is that there is no JavaScript SEO anymore, because we look at a lot of websites. It's so JavaScript SEO back in the day were websites like Hulu, like National Geographic, NASA, where they were all JavaScript. Right now, like H&M, I would never call it a JavaScript website. They're like purely what we would call, again, HTML. It's just basically about technical SEO. And just the final point for me is indexing your content is one of the key challenges now. And sorry, we have a quick to-do for our visitors, which I forgot about completely. So I didn't want to leave you guys without something actionable at the end. So closely monitor indexing stats. And we're actually building a tool set for that. Because there are no tool sets for that right now, but this is one of the key things. Monitor if your content is indexed, and monitor if there's anything that relies on JavaScript. And don't do that for the homepage. Go for every single layout that you have within your structure, and make sure that there is no metadata affected by rendering. This is something I cannot stress enough. Looking at like IKEA, looking at H&M, rendering shouldn't affect like canonicals, no index, and so on. And basically, we're going to be launching the crawler budget toolset soon, so you can sign up to our newsletter or basically follow us somewhere to find out about that. And let's go into questions. Oh yeah, and if you like, we can have like a 15 minutes consultation for free if you follow that link, just for like Searchmetrics webinar people. But yeah, Marcus, let's start with the difficult questions.
Nice, yeah, and amazing. Yeah, thank you very much. And hopefully everybody takes a screenshot of that slide, because now we also have here Bartosz' personal only email address. So go ahead, guys, make this 15-minute consultation, and please follow all the to-dos that Bartosz gave us during the webinar. It's pretty amazing. And like he said, it's not about JavaScript SEO anymore, which used to be exotic in the past. Now it's affecting almost everyone, especially like big consumer businesses like H&M, which should hire OneMe to fix their indexation problems. Okay, so we do have some questions from the audience. Again, thank you very much, Bartosz. So let's use the last 5 minutes to go over the questions. Interesting is we got more questions coming in about indexation. Okay, so I will try to kind of like merge them into maybe one big question. So it seems that a lot of people here in the audience have problems with that Google might index too many pages, especially pages with parameters and that kind of stuff. For example, in typical faceted navigation where you have category, product, then variations of the product, etc. Is there any best practice or recommendation from your side? I mean, like a simple one, like blocking that stuff like by robots.txt, but is there any other best practice you have avoiding indexation by Google?
Yeah, so basically, I don't think there is anything new I can say here. If you have, for example, if you're worried that your price range is gonna get indexed, or if your like again filters with no results are gonna get indexed, and so on, then again, it's some kind of indexing strategy based on robots, no index, canonicals. I wouldn't overdo canonicals though. Just use them wisely, because when you overdo canonicals, Google will start ignoring them site-wide, which is very often the case when SEO sculpture the page rank with canonicals, or sculpture the page rank, which is a very old school term, by the way, with hiding links with JavaScript. And then we actually had a case recently when developers blocked JavaScript script with robots and used that for hiding links. Google didn't really care about that, and they went and rendered that. Actually, they actually rendered that in this case when we didn't want them to, when they don't render some other things we would like them to. So I wouldn't use any tricks. With pages you don't want to have index, go either between robots with like some weird parameters. Robots is the way to go. If you can't use robots, use no index. Canonicals, really use them wisely. They're very, very cool, but yeah, I wouldn't use them for like fixing all of the indexing issues. Just a few.
Okay. I mean, we did though had this question and comment about data URLs. I will definitely take a look into this. That sounds pretty interesting. I have not thought about or tested it yet in avoiding crawling by using this new HTML standard data URLs. Then we do have another question. It's about infinite scroll. So like you said, with this Fibonacci test that you made, that Google is not stopping crawling the page, but at the same time you said Google is not scrolling. Have you seen any problems with infinite scroll pages?
So yeah, sorry.
Add content while scrolling all the time.
So basically, Google is using some kind of viewport. We can now have a discussion about the exact number of pixels within that viewport, but they do not scroll, especially with endless scrolls. So, and this is not something that was that's new. Basically, if you have endless scroll, you can have hard-coded HTML for search engines. This was used in 2000, I think, 14 or something. So it's a very, very old approach to pagination. You have rel next, rel preview for search engines, but users get endless scroll. So that's one. Yeah, sorry. The second part of the question with Fibonacci was basically that we didn't see any clear timeout, so we didn't we didn't see the 5 seconds rule that some people refer to, that Google is gonna time out after 5 seconds. We saw Google really working hard on the scripts we gave them and indexing them in a surprising capacity, like the capacity that would freeze your MacBook Pro, like top of the line CPU. So, so that's why we don't have any actionable data here, because we couldn't find a clear threshold that would be repeatable. Yeah, so we have random results.
Great. Okay, I think I more or less kind of merged most of the questions all together. If there are more questions from the audience, please go ahead and ask and send them to us. We will make sure that Bartosz and myself are going to answer your questions. Also, thank you, to the whole audience for being and staying in the webinar. Thank you again, Bartosz. I hope I can see you again at some point. If we don't see each other before Christmas, have a great Christmas with your family, and enjoy the time in Poland. Get some more sun rays. You deserve.
We have sun today.
That's great. Yeah, I'm not sitting in a room with a window, so I don't know how it is outside at the moment. I really enjoyed it. Honestly, you gave me a lot of new ideas, and I hope we can do a webinar soon again. I also got a lot of comments from the audience. They liked it. That thanks, great, amazing. So this is really cool. So thanks everybody again, and hopefully see you soon. Bye, bye.
So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah.
No, you have the last word. It's my fault. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. So just I wanted to say that looking at some of the questions, I think we need to do one more webinar about just indexing and information architecture and so on. But if any of you have questions, just email me. Replying to the rel next preview, I know they don't use it. That's totally right. Just meant that it was an old solution with HTML pagination. Yeah, so
yes,
that's it. Thank you so much, and yeah.
And Christina, I'm pretty sure we are going to organize a new webinar for indexation specifically.
Yeah, that's something we definitely need to do now.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody, and everybody have a great Christmas, and see you next year.